The last gentleman at the table said good evening in the particular way that meant good evening, and do not expect me to return. And Edwina Marsh watched him walk away with the practiced stillness of a woman who had learned, over the course of a long season, to make her face give nothing. She was 24 years old. She wore a gown of pale gray-green silk that had been let out once at the seams, and pressed so carefully that the alteration was nearly invisible, and she sat at the edge of the Ashworth Assembly's most celebrated supper room, with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight, and a small painted fan resting unopened across her knuckles. Around her, the room was everything she was not. Diamonds at every throat, laughter rising in bright arcs over the music, the smell of hothouse flowers and tallow and powder, and the particular warm press of 200 people who had arrived to be seen. She had come as companion to her aunt, Mrs. Aldred, who kept a small house in Marylebone on £240 a year, and who required Edwina's services at public assemblies because her knees troubled her, and she disliked navigating crowds alone. It was a respectable arrangement. It was the only arrangement available to Edwina after her father's death 2 springs past, and she had accepted it with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else, which was to say without complaint and without illusion about what it made her. It made her a companion, not a guest, not a debutante, not a young woman awaiting an offer. A companion. The first voicing had come earlier that evening, before the dancing began, when Lady Honoria Ashby had paused beside her aunt's chair and looked at Edwina with the pleasantly vacant expression of a woman examining furniture. "Mrs. Aldred's companion," she had said, to no one in particular, which was the precise social instrument for ensuring everyone present heard. "How diligent of you to bring her along. One does wonder what she makes of all this." She had moved on before Edwina could decide whether the sentence required an answer. Edwina had decided it did not. Now the supper table was nearly empty, and Edwina was considering whether she might unobtrusively move her chair 2 inches to the left, which would place her more firmly in shadow and reduce the probability of a second such survey. She had begun to calculate the angle when the chair directly across from her scraped back against the floor, and someone sat down in it. She looked up. The man who had sat down was not, in any obvious sense, the sort of man who sat at half-empty supper tables beside companions in gray-green gowns. He was 31 years old, though the winter light of his expression added years the calendar had not yet granted him. His coat was dark wool, his cravat precisely tied, his jaw set at an angle that suggested he had decided some years ago to allow his face no liberties it had not earned. He was the Earl of Carow. Every person in the Ashworth Assembly knew who he was. Every person in the Ashworth Assembly had watched, at various points in the evening, to see where he would sit. He sat here. Edwina had begun, instinctively, to rise. The movement was half complete when his voice stopped her. "There is no need," he said. "I have not come to displace you." His voice was level. It gave nothing away. She sat back down, because she was surprised enough to sit back down, and because she had not, in 6 weeks of the season, encountered that particular sentence from a man of his rank. He did not say another word for a full minute. He poured himself a glass of claret from the decanter on the table, looked at it, did not drink it. Edwina sat very still and tried to decide what was required of her. "You have been abandoned by everyone at this table," he said finally, without inflection. "That is either their poor judgment or their poor manners. In either case, it reflects badly on them and not on you." Edwina considered her response with the care of someone who had learned that precision in such moments was a form of protection. "I think it is simply the nature of assemblies," she said. "People move toward interest. I am not, at present, an interesting object. That is a considered opinion," he said. I am curious what produced it." She did not know what to do with his curiosity. She said carefully, 6 weeks of observation. Something shifted in his face. It was not a smile. It was something anterior to a smile, a brief reorganization of the muscles around his eyes that was gone before she could be certain she had seen it. He lifted the glass of claret, turned it once between his fingers, and set it back down without drinking. "I am Julian Ashby," he said, "though I expect you know that." "Yes," she said. "I am Miss Marsh, Mrs. Aldred's companion." He did not respond to that final identification the way she expected him to, which was to say he did not respond to it at all. He asked her instead what she thought of the music, and she told him truthfully that the second violinist was half a bar behind the rest, and that no one in the room had noticed because the dancing covered it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had noticed, and they sat in the candlelight of the supper room for another 20 minutes while the Ashworth assembly continued its bright commerce around them, and Edwina Marsh sat back in her chair and tried very hard not to feel that something in her evening had shifted on its axis. She failed at this. In the days that followed, she told herself, with the firmness of a woman who had learned not to construct castles on unstable ground, that the Earl of Carrow had simply required a quiet place to sit, and she had been the least demanding option. That was the sensible reading. She was a companion. He was an earl. He had a mother who had spent the better part of 3 seasons arranging his future, and that future, as everyone in the Ashworth Assembly's radius knew, was scheduled to include Miss Cecily Vane, a young woman of 20 years, with a fortune of £12,000 and the kind of beauty that had never once been called interesting in her presence, because her presence made the word seem insufficient. The second voicing came 4 days after the assembly, in the front drawing room of the Ashworth Rooms, where Lady Honoria had gathered a small afternoon party that included her son, her chosen candidate, and, by accident of proximity, Edwina herself, who had accompanied her aunt for reasons of the knee. Lady Honoria had not looked at her when she said it. She had looked at Miss Vane, and she had said, in the tone of someone making a generous observation, that it was so refreshing to see a young woman of real standing at these affairs, compared to the various hangers-on the season attracted, companions and so forth, who occupied chairs that might better belong to guests with something to recommend them. Miss Vane had smiled. She had a very white smile. She smiled it at no one in particular, which was the same instrument her future mother-in-law had used, and it landed in the same place. Edwina sat with her aunt's shawl across her knees, and her hands folded, and her expression entirely neutral, and did not give Lady Honoria the satisfaction of any other kind of response. She did not see Julian for 3 days after that. On the 4th day, she was walking back through the service passage of the house in Marylebone, after settling an account with the greengrocer, when she heard the sound of raised voices from the kitchen passage below, and she went down to find Lady Honoria's housemaid, a girl named Polly, who could not have been more than 15, and who had been sent ahead of her mistress with a note for Mrs. Aldred, standing in the kitchen doorway in tears, while Mrs. Aldred's cook informed her, with considerable volume, that she ought to have come to the front door like a person, rather than scratching at the back like a rat. Edwina stepped past the cook. She said, in the quiet, precise voice that she reserved for situations where precision mattered more than volume, that Polly had done exactly as she ought, and that anyone who suggested otherwise would answer for it. She took the note from the girl's hand, gave her a handkerchief and a piece of cold shortbread from the rack on the dresser, and sent her back up the street with a kind word and the directions she had apparently been too frightened to ask for. She did not know until later that there was someone in the corridor that connected the service passage to the front hall. She did not know that the corridor had a partial view of the kitchen doorway. She did not know, when she turned back to address the cook's affronted expression with a few additional words of quiet correction, that Julian Ashby had been standing in that corridor for perhaps 30 seconds, with his hat still in his hand, waiting to be announced to Mrs. Aldred, watching through the half-open door. She would not know any of it for some time. What she knew in those following days was that Julian began to appear. Not with declaration. Not with any obvious intention she could name. He appeared at his mother's afternoon party and took the chair nearest hers without explanation. He appeared at the lending library on Grosvenor Street, while she was returning a volume of natural history her aunt had not finished, and he asked, without preamble, whether she had found it worthwhile. And when she said she had found the chapter on migratory birds unsatisfying, because it failed to account for weather patterns in a systematic way, he had been still for a moment, and then had said that she was the first person who had told him that, and that she was almost certainly right. He issued small commands in a voice that carried no warmth and considerable authority. "Take my arm on this step, Miss Marsh. The stone is uneven. Come inside. The wind has changed. Sit down. Your aunt needs another quarter hour at least, and there is no merit in standing." She received each command the way she received rain, as a weather condition rather than an offer, and she told herself each time that it meant precisely nothing beyond the reflexive courtesy of a well-born man who could not help ordering his surroundings. Her wound told her this. Her wound had been delivered over the course of 6 weeks and 2 years of a father's slow dying and the reduction of everything familiar to a single arrangement, and it had the specific grammar of her particular situation. She was forgettable. She was a problem the season had no category for. She was the wrong kind of presence in a room organized around the right kind. Julian was being courteous. Courteous men were occasionally kind to companions and entirely capable of marrying someone else. She believed this. She believed it with the thoroughness of someone who had learned that careful belief was a form of self-preservation. If you have found yourself in the kind of story where you can see what the heroine cannot quite bring herself to see, then you already know what the audience knew by the end of the 3rd week of the season, which is that the Earl of Carow was not being courteous. But Edwina did not have the advantage of an audience, and she had made of careful disbelief a kind of discipline, so she pressed on. The midpoint of the season brought the matter of the miniature. There was an afternoon at the Ashworth Rooms when a dispute arose over a card game, as disputes at card games will, and during the confusion Julian had knocked his coat from the back of his chair, and in retrieving it had let something fall from the inner pocket and had picked it up again so quickly and with such focused attention that Edwina, sitting 2 tables away with her needlework, had noticed the quickness of it more than the object itself. She saw only a flash of ivory and a narrow gilt frame before it was back in his pocket, and his face was composed again, and he was helping to resolve the card dispute with the same level authority he brought to everything. She did not ask. She would not have asked under any circumstances, but that evening, after her aunt was settled, she sat in the small room that served as her private sitting room and thought about the quickness of the movement and the way his face had organized itself afterward, and felt something she could not precisely name, a kind of lateral grief for a thing she did not know and had no right to wonder about. She learned the rest from her aunt, who learned it the way her aunt learned everything, which was from 3 different women at 3 different teas. Julian Ashby's wife had been called Eleanor. She had died 3 years past of a fever that came and went in a week and left him in Carow Hall with a house full of her things and a particular stillness that had not lifted in the time since. They had been married 4 years. He had, people said, been devoted to her in the specific way that men who do not express devotion easily are devoted, entirely and without demonstration. The miniature was hers. He carried it in his coat pocket and had been observed to check that it was there, now and then, in the way of a man confirming a wound. Edwina sat with that knowledge and rearranged everything she thought she understood. And when she had finished rearranging it, she understood that his distance was grief's architecture and not coldness, and that she had been reading a building without knowing what it was built to withstand. This should have made her more careful. It did not entirely have that effect. The trouble was Caro Hall. Julian had mentioned it in passing, at the lending library, in the context of a conversation about the management of long winter gardens, and Edwina had said something about the difficulty of keeping a kitchen garden productive in the third week of March, and he had said that the kitchen garden at Caro was arranged in a way that addressed that problem, and she had asked how, and he had told her, in considerable and specific detail, and for the duration of that conversation she had felt, with great precision, what it might be like to be interested in a piece of ground she had no claim on. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself this with some force on the Wednesday of the 5th week, when Lady Honoria arranged a small theater party and seated Julian beside Miss Vane with the practiced authority of a woman who had been making arrangements in rooms for 40 years and knew exactly how to make them look accidental. Edwina sat 3 rows back and watched Miss Vane lean toward Julian to say something behind her fan, and watched Julian receive the remark with the same level expression he gave everything, and told herself that this was the correct order of things. Miss Vane had £12,000. Miss Vane had every qualification the season recognized. Miss Vane had not had to count the cost of having her gown let out. Edwina's needle missed its mark on the sampler she had brought, because she had brought it to have something to do with her hands, and she set it down in her lap and breathed carefully, and watched the stage and thought about nothing at all. She was becoming, she noted with the detached precision she preferred, mildly unreasonable about an earl who had once asked her opinion of a second violinist. The third voicing came at the Ashworth Society's Thursday afternoon reception, which was the last major event before the closing ball, and it came in front of 6 witnesses, which was, Edwina understood, not accidental. Lady Honoria had positioned herself at the room's social fulcrum, as she always did, with Miss Vane at her right hand and 2 matrons and a baronet's wife arranged around her, and she had waited until Edwina passed within range before she spoke. "Ah, Miss Marsh." The voice was warm and precisely calibrated. "Still with us, I see. I did think a companion season must be rather wearing, all this waiting about while one's better wishes circulate. One does hope you find it worthwhile, the view from the edge, as it were." 6 people waited. Edwina stopped walking. She looked at Lady Honoria with the full attention she usually kept carefully distributed, and she said, in the clear, unhurried voice that she had spent 24 years developing for exactly this type of occasion, "I find it a very instructive view, Lady Honoria. One learns a great deal from the edge about what occupies the center." She walked on. Her heart was beating in her throat for the next 3 minutes, but no one saw it, because she had long ago learned that the heart could be trusted to manage itself if the face was given clear instructions. That evening she sat at her desk and wrote a letter. It was addressed to her aunt. It said, in the careful, precise sentences she used when feeling required management, that she had concluded the season had run its useful course, and that she thought it would be sensible to withdraw before the closing ball, since there was no material purpose served by her presence at it, and that she was grateful for the months of provision her aunt had so generously extended. She signed it with her name. She folded it. She set it on the corner of the desk and looked at it. She did not seal it. She was still looking at it when she heard, from the direction of the hall below, the sound of a particular knock. Her aunt's parlor maid, whose name was Bess, brought up a card 20 minutes later. The card was Julian's. He had called, and Mrs. Aldred had received him, and he wished to know if Miss Marsh was available to walk in the garden for a quarter hour, if the evening air permitted. Edwina looked at the folded letter on her desk corner. She put on her shawl and went downstairs. The garden in Marylebone was not large. It had 3 rose bushes that had not yet come in, a stone bench, and a gravel path that could be completed in 12 steps if the steps were unhurried. Julian walked it beside her without speaking for 2 full circuits, which took approximately the amount of time Edwina required to decide that she was not going to make this easy for him by beginning. He stopped at the bench. He did not sit. He looked at the rose bushes, which were still mostly thorns. "My mother spoke to you today," he said, "at the reception." "She did. I heard the account of it from 3 different people before I reached the door." Edwina said nothing. "I'm sorry for it," he said. He turned from the rose bushes and looked at her directly, the way he did when he had decided to do something and had no interest in hedging it. She has a very clear idea of what is correct, and she does not find it easy to accommodate evidence that challenges the idea. "You need not apologize for your mother's opinions," Edwina said. "They are widely shared." "They are not universally shared," he said. She looked at him. The light was going, and the garden was very quiet. "What are you trying to tell me, Lord Carow?" He was still for a moment. He said, "That I have no intention of attending the closing ball without a partner I have chosen for myself." Edwina held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "I think you should be clear about what you mean by that." "I think," he said, with the quiet precision that she recognized as his equivalent of great care, "that you know what I mean. And I think you are afraid to believe me, because you have had considerable evidence that believing is a form of vulnerability, and you do not care to be made a fool." She wanted to say something precisely deflecting. She said instead quietly, "Because it was true, and she was 24 years old and tired of being careful." "Yes?" "Then let me be clear," he said. "I have a solicitor named Holt who can provide whatever procedural satisfaction is required. I have an estate that needs someone with opinions about kitchen gardens in March. I have been, for approximately 6 weeks, the least subtle man in London, and I believe you know it." She said nothing for a moment. She was learning, from the inside, what it felt like to have something carefully maintained come apart. She said, "Tell me about Eleanor." He did not flinch. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out the miniature, which was oval and ivory-backed and held a painted face with dark eyes and a slight expression of amusement. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "She would have found the second violinist quite funny." He folded his hand around the miniature and held it a moment, and then he put it back in his pocket. "She died 3 years ago. I carried the grief very badly for a long time, and then I began to carry it better. And then you told me that the second violinist was half a bar behind, and no one had noticed, and I thought about it all the way home." Edwina stood in the small garden with the thorny rose bushes behind her, and felt something she did not yet have the vocabulary for, which was the specific sensation of a door opening in a wall she had decided was solid. "I will come to the ball," she said. "I will not be made a figure of spectacle." "No," he said, "you will not." She went back upstairs and unsealed the letter. She burned it, very carefully, in the small grate. If you have been following Edwina's story this far and want to know how it ended, stay with me, because the closing ball of the Ashworth Assembly is where 6 weeks of accumulated patience produced its accounting. The closing ball of the Ashworth season was held in the assembly rooms on a Friday evening in late spring, when London had its particular quality of too many candles and not enough cool air, and every conversation carried the slightly elevated register of an occasion with stakes. Edwina arrived in a gown she had not worn yet, a deep blue silk that her aunt had pressed upon her with unusual authority 2 days prior, saying only that she had found it in a trunk from her own earlier season, and it wanted wearing by someone with the right coloring. The gown fit without alteration. It was, by any measure, the finest thing Edwina had put on in 3 years. She was not on Julian's arm. He had agreed, when she asked, that they would not arrive together, because she would not give the room the satisfaction of reading her entrance as a managed thing rather than a free one. She arrived with her aunt, and took a position near the third window from the east, which was where the air was best, and she stood and watched the room fill, and told herself that she was not watching the door. She was watching the door. Lady Honoria arrived at 8:15 with Miss Vane at her side, and both of them looked as certain as women look when they have ordered the world correctly and are waiting for it to perform. Lady Honoria's diamonds were very fine. Miss Vane's gown was rose-colored, as it often was, and perfectly fitted, and she moved through the receiving line with the easy authority of someone who expected to be pleased by everything the evening offered. Julian arrived at 8:30, which was when Edwina, by pure coincidence, had looked away from the door to speak to her aunt about the program. She did not see him enter. She became aware of him, the way one becomes aware of weather, a shift in the room's pressure, a slight rearrangement of attention that preceded his crossing the floor. He was not, in the ordinary sense, heading toward her. He was crossing the full width of the Ashworth Assembly's ballroom in 3 deliberate strides, which meant he had walked past Lady Honoria and Miss Vane and the assembled social record of 6 weeks of London season, and the room had arranged itself to watch, because rooms always arrange themselves to watch a man who walks with that quality of purpose. He stopped in front of Edwina. The room did not precisely go silent. Rooms rarely do. But the nearest conversations paused, and the pause spread outward like a stone dropped into still water, and by the time Julian spoke, roughly 2/3 of the Ashworth Assembly's closing ball was observing the exchange at the third window from the east. "Miss Marsh," he said. He offered his hand, not to lead her out for a dance, not to conduct her to supper. He simply held out his hand in the clear, unhurried way that meant the gesture was what it appeared to be, and he had no interest in ambiguity. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She said, with the quiet directness she had spent 6 weeks carefully concealing from everyone in this room, "You are making something irrevocable." "Yes," he said. "I am aware of that." She took his hand. The pause in the room completed itself, and then the conversations resumed. But differently. The way water resumes flowing after a stone has redirected it. Edwina was aware of the sound of Miss Vane's slippered feet making a small, precise adjustment across the polished floor. She was aware, at the edge of her vision, of Mr. Holt, Julian's solicitor, a slight gray-coated man who had positioned himself near the room's east door with a leather document case under his arm, and the careful expression of a man who was present for professional reasons and had been prepared to be present for professional reasons. She was aware, most particularly, of Lady Honoria. Lady Honoria had not moved from her position near the room's entrance. She was standing very still with her fan at a measured height, and her expression doing something that her expression, in Edwina's observation, had never done before, which was to rearrange itself from certainty into something more provisional. The script she had been working from for 3 seasons had just been set aside by its principal actor in front of 200 witnesses, and Lady Honoria was, for perhaps the first time in many years, standing in a room without a prepared response. Miss Vane said something, very quietly, to the matron at her right. The matron said nothing. Miss Vane looked at the floor for a moment. And then she looked at the door. And then she looked at Lady Honoria. And then she made the sensible choice, which was the choice available to a young woman of £12,000 and considerable charm, who had based her expectations on a reliable social script and could afford to revise those expectations in the presence of a better offer from another direction. She left with the dignity available to someone who had never been told she was wrong about anything, and was not prepared to begin tonight. Julian had not watched her leave. He was looking at Edwina. He said, quietly enough that it was between the two of them and the third window from the east, "My mother will require time." "I imagine she will," Edwina said. "She is not unkind," he said. "She is simply wrong." Edwina thought of the three voicings, the pleasantly vacant expression, the assembled witnesses. She thought of Polly in the kitchen doorway with her hands shaking. She thought of the gray-green gown and the needlework she had set down in the theater. She said, "I know." Lady Honoria did cross the room eventually, and she stopped before them with the posture of a woman who had decided that the situation required address rather than avoidance. She looked at Edwina for a moment. She looked at her son. She said in a voice that carried considerably less certainty than any voice she had used in Edwina's presence since the first evening of the season, "I see that your mind is settled, Julian." "It is," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The fan turned once in her hand. She said to Edwina, "You will find Carrow Hall rather large for a first winter." It was the closest to an accommodation that Lady Honoria was, in the circumstances, capable of producing. Edwina received it with the grace she had promised herself she would bring to this moment. "I am not afraid of large houses," she said. Lady Honoria nodded, once, and moved away through the crowd toward a chair near the far wall, where she sat for the remainder of the evening with the expression of a woman revising a document she had considered final. Mr. Holt materialized at Julian's left shoulder, with the timing of a man who had been waiting for a cue. Julian acknowledged him with a brief nod and turned to Edwina. "Holt has a settlement offer drafted. It is the formal first step, and you are under no obligation to receive it tonight. But he is here, if you wish." Edwina looked at Mr. Holt, who had the careful neutral expression of a solicitor who had seen a great many transactions and found this one, apparently, unremarkable on its procedural surface. She said to Julian, "I would like to hear the terms, yes?" Holt produced a single folded document from his leather case and spoke in the quiet undertone of a professional conducting business at an unusual venue with complete composure. The settlement was a jointure of £300 annually, secured on Carrow's Lincolnshire properties, which were the most productive of the estate's holdings, and ran to 500 acres of managed farmland and a further 70 of woodland. It was, by any accounting Edwina could perform on short notice, considerably more than adequate. It was also, she understood, the amount chosen by a man who had thought carefully about what security looked like from the inside of a constrained life. "It is fair," she said to Julian. "It was designed to be," he said. She had a moment of something that was not quite composure. Standing at the third window from the east with the Ashworth Assembly's closing ball arranging itself around her in candlelight and the sound of strings. She thought of the gray-green gown and the empty chairs at the supper table, and the folded letter she had burned in the small grate. She thought of the kitchen passage, and Polly's shaking hands, and the corridor where Julian had stood with his hat at his side, watching without moving. She thought of the ivory miniature, and Eleanor's painted expression, and the way he had said she would have found it quite funny. She said, "Thank you for staying that evening, at the supper table." He said, "You were surprised." "Surprised enough to sit back down," she said. His face did the thing it had done on the first evening at the supper table. That anterior motion around the eyes, that was not quite a smile, and was something that preceded it. This time it did not disappear. The dancing had resumed while they stood at the window. The second violinist was, as far as Edwina could hear, precisely on time this evening, which she noted with some satisfaction. Julian held out his hand again. She placed hers in it, and they walked out onto the floor. And the Ashworth Assembly made what room it could. Carrow Hall sat in Lincolnshire 30 miles from the coast, where the land ran flat and pale under wide skies, and the north wind came in off the sea in October and did not relent until well past March. The house was built of grey stone in the manner of the previous century, with a slate roof and windows that looked onto a kitchen garden arranged, as Julian had described, to maintain productivity into the third week of March through a system of cold frames and sheltered beds that Edwina, when she first walked its perimeter in November, found both sensible and quietly beautiful. The first months at Carrow Hall required a great deal of her. The house had been managed in the way of houses managed for grief's convenience rather than living's use, which meant that many rooms had been kept closed since Eleanor's death, and that the servants had grown accustomed to a quietness that was not precisely the quietness of a well-ordered household. Edwina opened rooms. She spoke to the housekeeper, Mrs. Webb, a solid, competent woman who had been waiting for 3 years for someone to restore the practical authority the house required. She found homes for the things that had been left in transit, neither stored properly nor put back into use. And she did all of this with the same quiet precision she had brought to her aunt's house in Marylebone, but with the particular additional quality of someone who understood that she was making something that was hers. Lady Honoria came to Carrow Hall in December, which was earlier than anyone had expected. She stayed a week. She and Edwina achieved, by the end of the week, a working accommodation that was not warmth, but was not hostility either, which was the most honest result available, given the history, and which both of them, Edwina thought, privately preferred to any performance of reconciliation they did not yet mean. Lady Honoria said, on the morning of her departure, that the kitchen garden was well managed, and Edwina thanked her for noticing, and they looked at each other across the Carrow Hall entrance hall with the expression of two women who understood each other precisely and had chosen, for the present, to proceed on that basis. Snow came in January, the thick early kind that settled on the kitchen garden's cold frames and made the managed rows invisible under white. Edwina stood at the library window, which had become her window in the way that things become yours when you use them regularly and without apology, and watched the snow come down in the late afternoon light. Julian came to stand beside her. He had been at his desk with the estate's accounts for most of the afternoon, the Lincolnshire properties requiring attention, and he still had ink on the side of his right hand. She had noticed some weeks ago that he always had ink on the side of his right hand by late afternoon, and she had concluded that this was one of the things that were simply true about him. The way the kitchen garden arrangement was true, and the second violinist observation was true, and the fact that he checked his coat pocket now and then was true. He reached into his coat pocket. He brought out the miniature. He looked at it for a moment, in the way he looked at things that required full attention, and then he set it face down on the library's writing table near the window ledge. Not hidden, not discarded. Set down. The gesture had the quality of something long considered and gently completed. Edwina looked at the miniature face down on the table. She said nothing, because nothing was required, and because Julian's face in the window's reflection had the particular quality of a man who had finished a long piece of necessary work and was uncertain what came next. She put her hand over his ink-stained one on the windowsill. Outside, the snow covered the kitchen garden in its orderly rows, the cold frames holding their careful warmth underneath. The house was quiet in the way that Carrow Hall was quiet when it was inhabited properly, which was entirely different from the quietness of grief. A fire burned in the room behind them. The miniature lay face down on the table. The snow fell. She had been surprised enough, 6 weeks into the London season, to sit back down. This was what had come of it. If Edwina's story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that mattered most, and if you would like more stories told like this one, the next is already waiting.